Black women, Asian, white, Latina, Native American women who throughout our nation's history have paved the way for this moment tonight. Women who fought and sacrificed so much for equality and liberty and justice for all, including the Black women who are too often overlooked, but so often prove they are the backbone of our democracy.
The fight began in Maryland. In 1648, a colonist named Margaret Brent appeared before the assembly to petition for the right to vote. Actually, she thought she deserved 2 votes, one as a wealthy landowner and another as an attorney to Lord Baltimore, proprietor of the colony. Lawmakers saw it differently. Brent was denied both votes, and Lord Baltimore condemned her. Angry at the rejection, she left Maryland for good and settled in Virginia. Margaret Brent was the first woman in America to ask for the right to vote. She would not be the last.
I'm a little nervous because I've never voted. So I did state elections. This is my first presidential election. So I'm not as nervous because I've done the voting process before, but as far as presidential, I think this is definitely major because this determines the state of not even just the country, us as individuals too. That determines how our lives are going to go for the next 4 years. You got to know who you're putting into run for you, not even just for the country, but for you. Who stands up for what you believe in? Who's fighting for what you want to fight for?
Suffrage, the right to vote, the right Margaret Brent demanded 372 years ago, would not be won for women until 1920, a century ago this year. Until then, women like Marilyn Pickens, a 21-year-old student at Morgan State University, were left without a voice in America's affairs.
If I wasn't able to vote, I would feel probably angry because I feel like you're not giving me a chance to let my voice be heard. How can I be a part of a country who doesn't let my voice be heard? Every voice should matter, not just men, not just everybody. Voices matter, especially women. Especially women. Voting isn't just a vote. It determines a lot of things. Who is in office determines a lot of things. I'm sure many people know Trump is trying to make abortions basically illegal. So you're letting a man tell a woman what to do with their body. And I just feel like if I wasn't able to vote, that means I would be giving the power to someone else to cast their vote for something that I probably don't even believe in.
In 1848, exactly 200 years after Margaret Brent was rejected by the colony of Maryland, 2 abolitionists, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth K.D. Stanton, convened the first Women's Rights Convention. The convention, held in Seneca Falls, New York, issued what it called a Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, containing 12 resolutions demanding equal rights for women in various areas. 11 of the 12 were approved unanimously. The last one also passed, but without unanimous consent. It was the one demanding the right to vote.
After adopting a resolution at Seneca Falls asking for the vote, women didn't really press for the vote. They would hold women's conventions every year up to the Civil War, but they spent most of that time talking about the other rights that women didn't have: the right to own property, the right to keep their own wages if they work, the right to divorce their husbands or to have custody of their children if they did divorce their husbands. Women couldn't speak in churches particularly, so they couldn't be ministers. But then after the Civil War, when some of the former abolitionists who formed the Radical Republicans started proposing that Black men get the vote. So suddenly the women seized upon the idea that they could have the vote too, and they should have the vote, possibly before Black men.
From the beginning, the battle for women's suffrage was tied with the battle to end slavery. Many of those who participated, including Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass, were also very active in the abolitionist movement. They battled together for causes in conventions that were held for the next 10 years. The conventions were interrupted in 1861 with the outbreak of the Civil War, which led to the emancipation of the enslaved African American people. Afterward, things would never be the same for the suffrage movement.
They had a huge falling out over the some of the male former abolitionists had declared that this was the Negro's hour and that they could not afford to try to get through the women's vote at the same time. Okay. So there was a great split in the movement. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, and another abolitionist woman, Lucy Stone, formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. And a lot of the Black people split their time between the two. Sojourner Truth supported those who thought that women should get the vote, for instance. Frederick Douglass did not. Frances E.W. Harper, who had been a lecturer, did not support that either. She was for letting the Black men get the vote first.
From that split came two organizations, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. The break lasted over 20 years, forcing voting rights advocates to choose sides depending on how important they felt it was to also agitate for the rights of newly freed African American people. The two organizations merged in 1890 as the National American Women's Suffrage Association under the leadership of Susan B. Anthony. And the former abolitionist was not above using racist methods to agitate for women's rights.
So she adopted what they call a Southern strategy, or a strategy of expediency, to court the South, because Southern women had never really joined the suffrage movement. And in order to get a federal amendment passed, they were going to need Southern support in Congress and in the states. She set up some meetings in the South. She traveled the South. She called a convention in Atlanta, to which specifically she asked Frederick Douglass not to come. He had come to all the women's meetings up to that point, and usually would be sitting on the dais or whatever. The sight of that in the South probably was not going to go over well. And she really kind of disinvited Black women. Maybe not so overtly as that they were meeting in segregated headquarters, but a woman named Della Hunt Logan, who was light enough to pass for white, attended anyway, and some other women may have passed and gone.
But as the 20th century dawned, the battle for women's suffrage had been going on for better than half a century, with little to show for it. Though a handful of states had extended women the right to vote, sometimes only in school board elections, since education was considered a woman's issue, the federal government still gave them no voice in the nation's affairs, and the generation that had begun the fight was less and less able to carry it on. By this time, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth were dead. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were in their 80s. If the battle was to be won, clearly it would take a new generation and new tactics to do it.
I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited because it's really happening. Like, it's election day, and we've been waiting for this moment for 4 years, and the time is now here. So I'm excited, but I'm also nervous because we won't know, like, you know how normal elections are. You find out, like, later on that night. I'm just like, we won't know until probably some weeks later, so I'm a little nervous about that part, but I'm excited to vote.
Casey Roan, a Montgomery County historian specializing in women's suffrage in Maryland, says that as women cast their ballots this year, they found themselves at a crossroads. A number of issues critical to them all seem to be coming to a head at once.
2020 is it's a really pivotal year for women. I think it's sort of a moment of peril for women for a number of reasons. The pandemic obviously has the potential to set women back a generation economically. We're seeing women having to retreat back into the home and give up their jobs and their employment, so that they can retreat into into a caregiving role. I hope that women were thinking about the need for better supportive social structures to remove that caregiving burden from women and to share it equally among members of our society. Hopefully women were aware of the historic threats to our democracy that were underway. I think this was women took their responsibility and obligation to vote seriously. I think we saw record turnout across the board from people. And women's reproductive rights are greatly threatened now. So I hope that women were bringing these issues to the ballot box.
For Pickens, there is one issue that looms above all the rest.
So the most important issues to me would have to be police brutality. That's always going to be number one on my list because I do have all brothers and they all are of color. So that kind of scares me that police have this power and they're abusing it. Like, we're supposed to look to police officers to help us, but when a police officer stops me or something, I instantly think, don't shoot me, please don't kill me. And that's sad that even little kids think that, like, oh my gosh, mommy, like, cops are out here killing us, and that's just sad. So police brutality would definitely be one. I don't know how we can try to fix things, but that needs to definitely be fixed. When you first go in or whatever, you got to get your ballot and stuff. So I was like, oh gosh, you're about to be here. It's going to take. But everything was like boom, boom, boom. And then you send in your vote, and I was like, okay, I did it. Like, I voted. Awesome.
The road to awesome took a decisive turn in the 1910s when two women joined the battle. For years, the movement had contented itself with holding meetings and drafting resolutions. While Susan B. Anthony did get herself arrested once for voting, the movement largely avoided confrontational tactics. By contrast, Alice Paul and Harriet Stanton Blatch were much more willing to take the fight to the streets.
Significantly, both of them had been in Britain and observed the much more militant movement over there. And, they did things like damaging buildings and sitting in at the parliament, and lots and lots of marches and picketing, much more strident than the American movement. So she learned tactics over there. She went to jail several times. She suffered force feeding because she went on hunger strike.
In 1913, Alice Paul organized the first political march down Pennsylvania Avenue. An estimated 8,000 to 10,000 women paraded down the street to demand the right to vote. There were floats, banners, and equestrian units. One of the marchers was African-American journalist Ida B. Wells, who had been asked to abide by rules segregating the march with the black women bringing up the rear. She refused, choosing instead to wait on the sidelines until the delegation from Illinois, home state of Abraham Lincoln, passed by. Then she stepped off the curb and marched in front of that group. Everything went well for about 4 blocks. Then the whole thing turned to pandemonium as angry spectators surged into the lines, tripping women, yanking them down from floats, knocking them to the ground, while police egged them on. Over 100 women had to be hospitalized. But the publicity brought renewed attention to the old fight for women's suffrage, especially considering that Paul had timed the march perfectly, one day before the inauguration of a new president, Woodrow Wilson, but she wasn't finished yet.
And she perfected the tactic of picketing the White House. No one had ever picketed the White House. And she kept steady pressure on Woodrow Wilson because, one, he was the head of his party, the Democrats. And that was the tactic of the Brits, to target the leading party, the ruling party, and try to get them to introduce legislation. She wanted Wilson to use his authority and powers to persuade Congress to pass an amendment.
In 1917, the United States had entered the Great War in Europe, and many women activists turned their attention to doing whatever they could to support the American men fighting overseas. But unlike during the Civil War era, they also kept up the pressure on the federal government to give women the right to vote, using a tactic that might be called the carrot and the stick. Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the American Women's Suffrage Association, personally lobbied President Wilson, working to gently persuade him to support her cause. But at the same time, women also kept up their tactic of embarrassing President Wilson by protesting in front of the White House.
They started arresting the picketers after the war started because they were seen as disloyal to the United States. And in fact, they were carrying around signs that said things like American women do not have liberty, and calling Wilson Kaiser Wilson. And in particular, they started being arrested when a Russian delegation was visiting the White House, I believe. They were considered an embarrassment. And many of them went to prison for long periods of time. They suffered horrific conditions, infested food. They had, no freedoms within the prison, of course, and was filthy. And many of them went on hunger strikes, and they were force-fed as well. Alice Paul herself was locked up in a psych ward and might never have gotten out if the psychiatrist hadn't said, no, she's sane. She's just stubborn.
The idea of women being manhandled in prison galvanized the country and put the issue of women's suffrage on the front burner for the first time. After 70 long years, things came to a head with a sudden rush.
All of that pressure, shortly after everybody was released from prison, Wilson changed his mind and started said he would support suffrage. He didn't credit the militants at all, but when he finally made a speech to Congress, he credited the women who had helped in the war effort. And the first time he put his support behind it, it didn't pass. And then eventually it did pass Congress in 1919, and then went to the states for ratification.
With 36 states needed for ratification, Tennessee pushed the 19th Amendment over the finish line on August 26, 1920, making women's suffrage the law of the land. Maryland, the first state where a woman petitioned for the right to vote, was the last to ratify the amendment, finally approving it in 1941. And even then, it took another 17 years until 1958 for the vote to be certified. By then, women had had the right to vote for 38 years. Since 1920, women have served at nearly every level of government. They have served as mayors, they have served as governors, they have served in Congress, they have served as cabinet officers, but the presidency and the vice presidency have always eluded them.
Former Vice President Joe Biden has been elected President of the United States. He is President-elect Joseph Robinette Biden at 77 years old.
With this victory, Kamala Harris is set to become the first woman and the first person of color to be the vice president.
I'm just so happy for her. Like, I'm ecstatic because we went from not being able to vote at all. All right, okay, so then Black men can vote, but they had to go through something. Then we can vote, but we had to go through tests. How many marbles are in the jar? They weren't taught to read, so they're going to give you a reading exam before you go vote. So now that it's just so easy, you sign up to vote, you go vote, you wait for the results. We waited for the results. Now she's here, and it feels good.
100 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment, so much has changed. And yet the historian Casey Roan says we are still confronting issues that would have been familiar to voters in 1920.
We think about a lot of these women who have been sort of the face of our current political moment, the congresswomen of the squad. I mean, these are, generally younger women of color who are leading the conversation about political change and political possibilities in our country. And I think have been really targeted by oppositional forces who disagree with their policy positions. And we've seen that really happen in a very, really racialized way. And so I think, this really shows how, in a lot of ways, how little has changed since 1920 when white supremacy was at the forefront of the conversation about voting. I mean, if you think back 100 years ago, we were having this national conversation about who should have the right to vote and whose votes would be counted, and that's the same situation that we're in today.
Of course, the election of 2020 brings one change that is indisputably new, something that would have seemed nearly impossible 100 years ago, meaning the election of the first woman to the White House, Senator Kamala Harris, a woman of African American and Indian American heritage, will serve as vice president in the administration of President Joseph R. Biden.
This year is one for the books for sure.